up on Dialogue Weekend. 2020 is the year in which China expects to end extreme poverty nationwide once and for all. So what final challenges remain? Kim Jong Un announces he may soon deploy a new weapons system and resume the nuclear program. How to break this stalemate on the Korean Peninsula. Lastly, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison visits his country's fire-ravaged areas, but hints at no change in climate policy. What price might his people pay? Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Well, welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qindu. Here with me in the studio are Wu Changhua and Andy Mok. Welcome to both of you. Well, the year 2020 will be the milestone when China will put an end to the extreme poverty. That means the goal will be achieved 10 years ahead of the target set by the United Nations. In 2030, the whole world hopefully will be lifted out of poverty. So if you look at the Chinese situation, as I said, right now is already 850 or 60 million people have been lifted out of poverty over the past 40 plus years. For people who are following the China development, of course, it's a standing feat, unprecedented probably in human history, at least in Chinese history.
Absolutely. I think you talked about the 4 decades, in the past 4 decades. I think more progress has been achieved definitely in the last decade or so. If you look at the track record, China has been managing lifting at least 10 million people out of poverty every year, particularly in the last 7 years or so. So this is achieved by tremendous efforts. And for instance, there is a clear vision priority set by the political leaders in this country. We need to achieve zero poverty literally by end of this year, 2020. And it's not just a vision, it's a timeline, but very importantly, a pathway has been worked out in terms of different milestones, policy targets and goals, and the national budget, finance, incentives are pretty much organized around that, and particularly getting down to specific projects, focus on the regions, different situations there, getting local governments, business communities, and even the society, everyone together, working with the government to address those issues. So it's a very integrated strategy. China has definitely set a role model. I think there's a number which probably can tell the story clearly. If you look at globally, right, and for every 100 people out of poverty in the last few decades, 70 of them actually were from China. So China has contributed tremendously, not only to its domestic development actually, but also to the global process in terms of lifting people out of poverty.
The overall development.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it also, in a sense, reflects the Chinese philosophy, political philosophy. For example, poverty alleviation has been one of the top 3 priorities for the Chinese leadership. So, serve the people is not an empty slogan, and it's economic development is not only serving the rich, the powerful, the privileged, but also the underprivileged, most importantly.
I think that's absolutely true. So, from one perspective, from a societal, from a government perspective, this is putting a safety net for those at the bottom of society. So no one falls through the cracks, no one's left behind. But I think also we look at it from the perspective of someone suffering from poverty. What's very important is the slogan. So it's not just deeds, but also the communication strategy, if you will, to show that the government really understands the perspective, the plight of those in poverty. So there's this so-called 2 don't worries, 3 guarantees. So the 2 don't worries are food and clothing. So the absolute basic requirements for survival. If you can't eat, if you don't have clothes to wear to keep you warm, how can you survive? But then the 3 guarantees of an education, healthcare, and safe housing. So for those of our audience that might not know, but some of the poor, the extremely poor in China, really live in places that are not that safe. Mud houses, things like that. So the ability to deliver these 5 goods, as they were, I think really shows the perspective of the government in terms of looking to address not just the physical, but also the psychological needs of those in poverty.
And another dimension too is also about the capability to participate in the mainstream economic activities through the education, but also through actually enhance the infrastructure, right? We often know why people are poor. If you deep dive into the reality, because they were stuck in some area without transportation, without electricity, without education. But now actually the government policy pretty much target all those key elements So pull them together, not only to lift the people out of poverty, absolute poverty, the bottom line, which is set at 4,000 RMB per year per capita income, but very important to continuously actually lift them, keep them improving and, continue to improve their livelihood and also their capability to grow.
For me, in a sense, you can see the poverty alleviation is a long way. I mentioned like over the past several decades. I think it's also like the rising tide effects, right? During the whole economic development, you do have the creation of a billionaire, millionaire, a lot of people getting much, much better off. But at the same time, the whole, including people in the far remote regions, in the rural area, they're also getting much better off than the previous decades.
Yeah,
but
I think, billionaires, millionaires, or billionaires, now people celebrate the success, sort of part of the success of the economic growth. But for a country, very importantly, you need to lift everyone actually together, bring everyone with you to develop, rather than keeping, the gap between the rich and the poor continue to divide or enlarge, but rather really to, I think, rich people can continue to be more successful, but in the meantime, you need to bring the bottom part actually of the society of the people, which is usually the majority, be with you and contributing to that process.
I think this is the key challenge for governance, right? Is that if you strive to make everyone equal, then you reduce incentives for people to be successful. I think China recently just reached the largest number of millionaires in the world, surpassing the United States, which was number one for many, many years.
Huge success, actually.
Yeah. But not letting that gap get too wide either. So I think that is one of the challenges of government, is how to balance this letting people be successful while not leaving anyone behind. And I think over the last 40 years, we've seen the success of China in both of these areas.
That's right. Along the rapid economic expansion, you do have this heavy investment in infrastructure, which also helps some of the villages, for example, to sell the products.
Necessary conditions.
And also the investment in education, not only in the city area, but also in the country area. So all those investment in the welfare network over there, but also in the recent years, past like 7-8 years, also there's called, the Chinese, we call it like a precision poverty alleviation, or the targeted alleviation method. That's probably more innovative and more impressive for a lot of people.
It's significant in a way, say, you need the knowledge and information to know who are in the absolute poverty sort of group, right? So you need to know exactly where they are, who they are. So this is one dimension the government has invested tremendously, particularly deploying digital technology. Now China has literally established 100 million sort of peoples in poverty, their digital ID. So you know exactly where they are, how they're living their daily lives, and what opportunities, what kind of subsidies actually the government or everyone is supporting that, how they're developed, basically. So that's one dimension there. And the other side, actually, I think, you look at the root causes of the poverty, right? In many cases, actually, they do not have livelihoods or opportunities there. So by knowing more, you know where they are, where they're located, then you can pretty much plan, how you're going to support them in a much more effective way. For instance, what kind of industries, what kind of capabilities, access to the markets. In that context, actually, I think Chinese companies like Alibaba, because of the digitalization, the technology capabilities there, so you started to have large companies like Alibaba, JD.com, and many others in the logistics, e-commerce to step in, right, creating the flow, actually connection between people where they're located where they are poor, and connect them to the market, and that also offers tremendous support for that.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, this whole digital backbone, big data analysis is crucial. But I think what China's also doing is putting feet on the street or boots on the ground, as it were, meaning that government officials, party officials down to the village level have a certain responsibility or quota to visit, spend time with so many poor families per day, per week, per month, to see what the actual situation is. So it's not just sitting at a desk behind a computer looking at data, but actually being out in the trenches, as it were.
This year marks the end of the extreme poverty. We'll certainly come back and touch upon this topic again. Well, it's not only in China, but also, of course, like a neighboring country in the Korean Peninsula, North Korea has their own goal actually to develop the economy of this country. But due to this security situation, which is complicated, which is challenging, and now it's difficult for them to focus on economy because at the same time you have to deal with this security situation. And in particular, basically we are talking about the DPRK and the United States, whether that continue to follow the path of a peaceful negotiation or something else will happen.
I think for the DPRK, this is an enormously important issue because first, the DPRK with what, about 25 million people, it's not a huge country, not a lot of arable land, but I think the key economic statistic to understand how important this is for the DPRK is they spend something like 25% of their GDP on defense. So think about President Trump is trying to strong-arm NATO allies to spend at least 2%.
2%, yes.
So this is 25%. Think of it as a tax on the economy, and how much that could be diverted or allocated to improving the lives of the citizens of the DPRK. So I think this is an existential security issue, but it's also probably the biggest obstacle to sustainable economic development in the DPRK.
But of course, we know over the past couple of years since this Singapore summit between Trump and Kim, so people were expecting some progress will be made, and there is a self-imposed moratorium in terms of testing nuclear weapons and long-range weapons by North Korea. And at the same time, U.S. also exercised a certain restraint, for example, not to hold large-scale military drill with South Korea. But obviously that's not enough, and there's no new progress being made. So that's why we are seeing this kind of this stalemate, and North Korea is somehow losing patience. They are trying to see more progress, more talks with Washington.
As the story is sort of unfolding, and we definitely witnessed the uneasiness and frustration on the part of Kim Jong Un and the leader, and that partly triggered by the summit, because there was a lot of expectations raised very high up there after the bilateral summit there. So there was supposedly a timeline worked out, something delivering some outcome by the end of 2019, but somehow nothing happened so far. And very interestingly, I think on one side, if you look at the recent national conference of the Labour Party, highest level conference in DPRK, is that they decided to reshape their national development policy, really emphasizing the importance of economic growth, because they realized, as Andy said, 25% on defense, how you develop your economy. So now if you look at reading the documents, they now emphasizing the importance about agriculture, about the infrastructure, technology, and education, among all the others as we were talking about here. But in the meantime, they just cannot possibly totally get out of this defense part, right? They have to continue to keep this deterrence, nuclear deterrence, in order to make sure if something happened to them, they will still have this sort of capability somehow to do something. I don't think there will be war triggered down the road. It's not for the sake for anyone, but somehow that's the current situation for DPRK at this moment.
But that's understandable on one hand, especially with what happened to the top military general in Iran being assassinated by the U.S. side. And I think that somehow hardened the position for the top leadership in North Korea. You got to put the security in your own hands. You can only rely on yourself in terms of security. So that's why probably they see even a more urgent need to develop more powerful weapons. That's why we heard about this new strategic weapon, right?
Sure, this Christmas surprise.
Yeah, to make sure. You have
which hasn't come yet.
You have a security, and then you can develop your economy. But the problem is you have to sort out the relationship with the United States.
Yeah, no, and I think that obviously this has dominated the news cycle, the strike against Soleimani, the assassination. And I think, a lot of people are looking at it purely from a U.S.-Iran perspective. But I think if we step back, we're really in uncharted territory here, because what I think has happened is we look at that now assassination has become part of the diplomatic toolkit of the United States, and what does that mean going forward? And I think especially in places like the DPRK, perhaps Venezuela, other countries that are deemed adversaries of the United States, that if this two-step process of designating an organization, even a government organization, as a terrorist organization, thereby laying the legal framework, at least from the U.S.'s perspective, of assassinating or killing even a very senior government official, I think has to have the DPRK probably going back to a blank page and thinking about what is the stance or the strategy that they should pursue.
I think one thing actually important for DPRK at this moment is sort of, if not totally canceling or withdrawing the sanctions issued by UN Security Council, which is constraining the growth, the development of the country at this moment. So that's somehow a very important factor influencing actually the future. We will see. We don't know yet at this moment because the unpredictability on the President Trump side and, of course, on the leader Kim side as well. So I think that's creating huge uncertainty or risk in the North Asia, sort of this region for the security, the future.
Exactly. This kind of uncertainty and also potential risk is keeping the country somehow from further developing its economy and the overall development. But let's set our eyes further to the Oceania, Australia. There you have, there's a loss of lives, 18 firefighters and volunteers were killed, and also about 1,200 homes were lost, and more than 3 million hectares of land are being scorched because of the bushfire. So this is in a sense, natural disaster, because this is the season of a bushfire. But on the other hand, to a certain extent, it's also like called man-made because of the climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really the latest episode is New South Wales of Australia, and people there literally living through the nightmare, of the worst bushfires in their recent history ever. I think climate change and also somehow the poorly coordinated government's response to the emergency have this really made this situation even worse. On the climate change side, and the year 2019 is already recognized as the hottest and driest year in Australia's recent history. On the government side, actually, was sort of unfortunate, and the Prime Minister Morrison somehow planned his vacation, sort of, in that sort of time frame. Really, really bad timing, and really attracting a lot of finger pointing actually to him and his government as well. The bigger picture is that, and as we all know, Australia's economy relies heavily on fossil fuels. We all know the mining resources of petroleum, natural gas, coal, among others, iron ore as well. And so you could imagine politically the industry's resistance to take more aggressive actions in terms of addressing carbon issues is there, right? And that's why Australian government politically in the international process around climate change has been regarded as sort of a dragger, lagger, and also very passive there, which is sort of echoing, President Trump, actually the U.S. situation there, even though Australia has not just announced this withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. But somehow I'm hoping, and through this sort of disasters and natural disaster, the society will wake up quickly and really demanding for change. And also somehow the industry sector will also wake up and somehow started to take actions. Somehow through that process and through the political process as well, Australian government will be able to really shift towards more aggressive actions, tackling climate change, and really transform its economy towards a new Green Deal like what Europe is doing now.
Well, when I think that back in 2017, when Scott Morrison was the treasurer, not the prime minister yet at that time, he brought into the parliament with a chunk of coal. He basically waved the piece of coal saying, "Don't be afraid, don't be scared, this is a nice coal." So he basically attacked his peers from the Labour Party, and he has been a staunch supporter of the coal mining industry over there. Even today, despite the acknowledgement of, there is some link probably between the bushfire and climate change, he still continually to support the coal industry and refuse to take any effective measures against the climate change.
Yeah. Well, I think this is an unavoidable problem because part of this problem, of course, is political, as you were saying. But the issue is especially in democracies. It's not just one person, one vote, but also dollars get votes too. And when you look at a country like Australia that, as we just mentioned, so dependent on natural resources, fossil fuels, it's really difficult to go against that political tide. But I think that being said, it's not just an Australia problem. Look at the wildfires in California. Look at the hurricane damage in places like Florida. And it's a juxtaposition of different factors: economic development, politics, climate change. And I think this is a classic example of what's called the tragedy of the commons, meaning, say Australia was able to muster the political will to eliminate, all forms of global warming, right? Other countries would say, well, we probably can't do that right now. So it takes unified action, and unfortunately, I think that will be quite difficult to achieve, given the world we're in.
But the thing is, like for Australia itself, is a big country in terms of the size, geographically. But also it's a big island, and it's more vulnerable than other nations, for example, to climate change, to whether increase of the temperature or decrease of the temperature, etc. It's almost somehow in a similar situation like this Pacific Island nations.
It's just bigger. The land mass is much bigger.
And that's why in a small town, when the prime minister visited the citizens, he basically was driven away by the angry local residents. People are not happy.
I think through the media, actually, international media capturing, what's unfolding through the bushfires, particularly on the political side, I think Australian people more and more definitely will demand more actions there because they're living in it, right? And they don't like that at all. And what do they do then? They have to somehow to push the industries and also their political leaders. Hey, you have to take more actions there. Very importantly, I want to point out actually, there are role models already. So there are countries like the U.S., Brazil. So there are small number of countries that still sort of denying the climate change, trying to drag this process, postponing the actions as soon as possible. But then if you look at the other side, European unions actually have committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050.
2050.
Halving their literally emissions by 2030. And China somehow is really catching up and moving towards that direction as well. So if this one glass half full, half empty, so of course there are, the empty part, but very important that there's a half full part. And we need to figure out actually how to work together to grow that actually to the full, basically.
This is really, on one hand, is an awareness issue, like the public awareness and also the awareness in the political class over there. Yes, you have a reliance on this coal mining industry, but what about looking forward into the future? What about the renewable energies? What about investing in the future?
They all exist. To be fair to Australia, if you look at China's solar, energy technology development, many of them originated from Australian universities, labs, right? And some of the CEOs actually, business leaders for solar companies, they got their PhD actually from Australian universities there. Domestically, since I do go to Australia once or twice every year, so I can have a certain level of familiarity with it. So if you look at renewable energy, solar definitely is coming on board very, very fast. But somehow, and the people are advocating, even from the asset management, the financial institutions there, they are shifting towards divest from fossil fuel portfolios, moving towards green, renewable energy and other clean sectors there. But somehow it's not, the part is happening, but which is not big enough actually to quickly, fundamentally, to change the
society.
So the trend is there. I don't think Australia can just stay out of it. No, they cannot stay out of it. This is climate change agenda globally. But it's more like the pace, whether the society, everyone will come together to really accelerate that process, to shift that. I think that's more fundamentally more important.
Yes. Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, Carlos Ghosn is, I don't know, like it's a very high-profile executive manager, let's say. Previously, before his fall from grace, he was considered as a superstar in revitalizing Nissan and Renault, and also forming this alliance with Mitsubishi, becoming this second largest auto producer in the world. So his face and his image was on the stamps in Lebanon, and also the lunchbox in Japan, and even in the comic books. But now, a completely different understanding of the person.
Yeah. Well, one thing about Carlos Ghosn, I think he might not be as well known in the English-speaking world, but he's on par with like a Jack Ma or Steve Jobs, meaning he's not just a business success story, but as you mentioned, someone that has had quite a large cultural impact in Japan. Lunchboxes in comic books,
Right.
seen as a folk hero.
Right.
And today, of course, he's been charged in Japan as a criminal. So quite a fall from grace.
Well, I know you have different ideas about Ghosn.
Yeah, I think whatever have you said already. But if you look at the facts,
But that's the past.
That's the past. But then I wouldn't say. I think that this is sort of on the surface, on the table. If you go deeper into the reality, there seems to be a dark side of it. I think if you look at what the whistleblowers actually first identified, his misconduct there.
Financial misconduct.
Yeah, financial
yeah.
misconduct. So for instance, actually, he's underreporting his income, salaries, actually. And he's also directing his personal losses to the company, to Nissan, at about $60 million. And he had really this under-table deals with the supplier of Renault. And but also, actually, he's been take advantage of abusing the money, embezzling the money to buy his personal properties in different parts of the world there. And those are four misconducts pretty much been proven, being basically approved. See, those are the facts there. So as I said, and that's why I disagree. Say yes, on the surface, whatever, but really, if you look under the table, there were a lot of deeds I think that have been uncovered now. That's why actually the Japanese judiciary system is holding him accountable, and he started this prosecution process, trying to make sure to really how to convict him for how many years. I think I add that part of the story. Say yes, you have this sort of image on the table, and then actually under the table there are a lot of darker.
If I can, I'd just like to make 2 points about that. I think one, even if that were true, what I think is interesting about this case is he being treated differently than Japanese executives that have done similar things? Because apparently his
Not
number
really.
two
I think the same.
is charged with the same, I wouldn't say crimes, but same misdeeds, and he was not arrested. The second point I'd like to make, though, is that this way it's being reported in the Western media, that the Japanese judiciary system is not fair because there's a 99% conviction rate. And China gets criticized for this as well. And I think it's worth pointing out that these systems are different from the US or the UK system in that a lot of the work is done up front in the prosecution. So people are not charged until there's a fair amount of evidence to show that they're guilty. That doesn't mean that this case is being treated fairly or not, but I think it's worth mentioning for our audience that just to say if there's a high conviction rate, that means the system is unfair, I don't think is correct to say.
I definitely agree with that, actually. I think there is another element to point out. I think in the Japanese judiciary system, there's literally zero tolerance for crime. For corruption.
And the reality is, the fact is like he escaped from justice. And of course, there's a problem. Well, with that, we are coming to the end of today's show. You can watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can follow me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.